Midnight over Iron Bottom Sound feels less like night and more like an absence of the world. No moon, no horizon. Just a black sheet of water rolling beneath the hull of PT Boat 44, somewhere north of Guadalcanal. The crew speaks in whispers, though even whispers feel too loud. Every man knows that a single mistake, a spark, a clang, a burst of exhaust, can mean a destroyer's searchlight pinning them in the dark. Down below, in the cramped engine room, one mechanic crouches beside the Packard engines. Sweat beads on his forehead, even though the night air is cold. His hand rests on the lever that forces the exhaust underwater, an idea he swore would work, though many still think he's crazy. Running a PT boat on a single muffled engine at this speed is like balancing a knife on a fingernail. Too little power, and you drift. Too much, and you roar. Above deck, the skipper stares through binoculars at tall shadows moving across the black water. Japanese destroyers of the Tokyo Express sliding fast toward Guadalcanal. The PT boat creeps closer, nearly silent. A torpedo crewman leans in and murmurs, "Engines, steady. They still can't hear us." And with that, we step back to understand how the war brought these men and this insane idea into the deadliest waters on Earth. By the summer of 1942, the Pacific War had become a struggle defined by distance, night, and the growing reach of the Imperial Japanese Navy. After the shock of Pearl Harbor and the rapid Japanese advances across Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific, the United States made its first major counterstroke, the landings on Guadalcanal in August 1942. What began as a desperate attempt to seize an unfinished airfield turned into a grinding, months-long campaign fought on land, in the air, and, most violently, across the narrow stretch of water known as the Slot. Geography dictated everything. The Slot was a long, straight channel running through the Solomon Islands, bordered by jungle-covered ridges and narrow coastlines. Its shape made it a natural highway, and the Japanese used it for nightly high speed. Resupply runs to the embattled garrisons on Guadalcanal. American Marines quickly gave these missions a name that stuck: the Tokyo Express. Destroyers, fast, heavily armed, and crewed by seasoned night-fighting sailors, raced down this waterway under cover of darkness, unloaded supply barrels, and tore back north before dawn. Their routines were so disciplined, their timing so precise, that the Americans could almost set their watches by them. But regularity cut both ways. If the Japanese had a route, the Americans had an opportunity. To counter these sleek, powerful destroyers, the U.S. Navy brought in a weapon that was the opposite of everything the Tokyo Express represented. Patrol torpedo boats, PT boats. Small, wooden, lightly armored, but unbelievably fast. Just 77 to 80 feet long, weighing a fraction of a destroyer. Each carried 3 Packard V-12 engines capable of pushing the craft to more than 40 knots. They bristled with torpedoes, Saddam 50 caliber machine guns, and a crew whose toughness often outmatched their armor. Where destroyers represented range and discipline, PT boats embodied improvisation, speed, and audacity. The first squadrons arrived. In the Solomons Raw, their crews still learning the unforgiving ecosystem of jungle, saltwater, and night that defined the region. They set up at makeshift bases like Tulagi, living in tents or crude huts, improvising repairs under palm trees during the day, and launching into the darkness after sunset. At night, the air grew humid and heavy. Visibility dropped until even nearby islands were only vague silhouettes. The sea itself reflected no light. It absorbed it. Entire boats disappeared into the dark just a few dozen yards off the beach. For PT crews, this environment was both a shield and a trap. The Japanese destroyers they hunted were some of the best night-fighting ships in the world. Their crews trained rigorously in blackout operations, silent maneuvering, and coordinated torpedo attacks. They possessed the infamous Type 93 Long Lance torpedoes, oxygen-fueled weapons capable of traveling farther and faster than any Allied equivalent. Against such vessels, PT boats were outgunned 100 to 1. A single destroyer could unleash a storm of 5-inch shells, machine gun fire, and star shell illumination that could tear a wooden boat apart in seconds. And yet, the mission remained the same. Find them, get close, launch torpedoes, escape into the dark. Early encounters were harrowing. PT boats running at combat speed created huge phosphorescent wakes, glowing trails that sliced across the black water like neon signatures. Their 3 roaring engines could be heard long before they were seen. Lookouts aboard Japanese destroyers often picked up the PTs with the naked eye or by sound alone, prompting blinding searchlights to snap on and sweep the ocean. Many PT crews survived their first missions only because the night was vast and chaotic enough for them to disappear again. It did not take long for American officers and enlisted men alike to realize a simple truth: speed was killing them. Running at 30 or 40 knots gave away their position instantly. Their own engineering design, originally intended for coastal attack missions, proved dangerously mismatched to the realities of Iron Bottom Sound. That mismatch led to arguments, frustration, and quiet experiments in the engine rooms. Each PT boat carried a 3-man engine room team. Machinists' mates who lived every day in the roar of Packard V12s, who knew the difference between a healthy engine and a dying one by the change of a single vibration. They also understood something that most commanders overlooked. Noise could be manipulated. PT boats had muffler systems designed to route engine exhaust either out through ports above the waterline, creating the familiar thunderous roar, or down into the sea, where the water absorbed and diffused the sound. The design wasn't new. It was part of the boat from the start. But in the Solomons, men began wondering if it could be pushed further, used in ways not originally intended. If a PT boat could run on just one engine, with its exhaust forced, underwater, perhaps its noise signature would shrink to almost nothing. Perhaps it could drift, glide, and approach unseen. Perhaps speed wasn't the weapon. Silence was. It was in this environment, tight quarters, oppressive heat, constant danger, that one mechanic began experimenting with an idea he would soon call insane. And soon, he would convince a skipper to test it against the Tokyo Express. And that moment is where this story begins to shift. The idea of silence as a weapon didn't appear in a conference room or a stateside research lab. It grew in the engine rooms of PT boats, cramped metal caverns lit by a single red bulb, packed with fuel lines, heat, and the constant vibration of 3 monstrous Packard V12s. Down here, machinists' mates worked shirtless in the tropical heat, wiping sweat from their eyes and oil from their hands as they nursed engines older than some of the crewmen on deck. PT boats were marvels of raw power, but they were also noisy, temperamental machines. With 3 1,200 horsepower engines roaring at once, they produced a deafening signature that echoed for miles across open water. The exhaust ports above the transom belched sound and flame. Even when muffled, the engines kicked out a rhythmic rumble that could be heard long before a boat came into view. Every crewman knew the truth. When PT boats moved fast, they announced themselves to the world. Japanese destroyers relied on this. Japanese naval doctrine prioritized night fighting with an almost obsessive discipline. Destroyer crews were trained to detect enemy vessels without radar, using little more than sharp eyesight, practiced listening, and coordinated illumination. Some destroyers carried basic hydrophones designed for submarine detection, but even without sophisticated gear, they could catch the harsh thundering of PT engines from astonishing distances. With that single clue, they could predict direction, deploy searchlights, and open fire. And when a destroyer opened fire, the sea turned lethal. PT crews described the experience as standing in front of a collapsing building made of light. White columns of star shell illumination burst overhead, revealing the boats in brilliant daylight. Tracer fires stitched across the surface like burning ropes. 50 and 5-inch guns slammed the water with explosions big enough to lift a boat off her course. Wooden hulls cracked and burned under this punishment, and the only defense was speed, to run, weave, and pray. The darkness returned quickly enough. But running meant noise, and noise meant discovery. It was this deadly cycle that pushed creative minds in the PT squadrons to re-examine the very heart of their boats. Some officers suggested turning off 1 or 2 engines to reduce wake. Others wondered if they could drift in toward the destroyers instead of charging at them. But among the mechanics, the men who listened to engines the way musicians listen to chords, the debate turned toward mufflers. Each Packard engine had a muffler system with twin modes: open exhaust, which vented gases directly into the air, producing maximum power and maximum noise, and underwater exhaust, which routed gases through ports submerged beneath the stern, dampening sound but increasing back pressure and heat. The underwater exhaust system had limitations. At high RPM, pressure buildup could damage the engine, foul the fuel mix, or cause overheating and catastrophic failure. But at low RPM, with careful throttle control, a boat could run unbelievably quiet. The engine note swallowed by the sea, the exhaust reduced to little more than a gentle stream of bubbles. That simple reality sparked the mechanic's idea. What if a PT boat could approach a destroyer at a crawl, nearly silent? Not at the standard 30-knot charge, not at half speed, but at a barely perceptible drift, running 1 engine at idle. The other 2 shut down, exhaust fully underwater, wake nearly erased, sound signature almost gone. It was a direct contradiction to established doctrine. PT boats were sold as fast attack craft, ambush predators that struck with speed, not stealth. But the Solomons were rewriting the book every night, and the men who rowed these wooden boats were learning to adapt faster than Washington could update its manuals. Soon enough, the idea spread through whispers on Tulagi's shoreline. Crews talked during maintenance sessions over tin cups of bitter coffee, or while wiping condensation from the torpedo tubes before a night sortie. Officers overheard the talk. Some dismissed it immediately. Others grew curious. A few dared to try short tests in the safety of nearby coves. One thing became clear. A PT boat could indeed move almost silently. But there was a catch. Running on 1 submerged exhaust engine left the boat underpowered. There was no margin if something went wrong, no ability to sprint away if discovered, no quick acceleration to dodge a shell. It was like creeping toward a lion in tall grass. If he saw you, you were finished. Still, the PT crews were desperate for any edge. Japanese destroyers were completing their resupply missions almost unmolested. The Marines on Guadalcanal needed every disrupted supply run the PTs could cause, and the men on the boats needed a way to survive long enough to make a difference. By late 1942, the silent running experiment wasn't rumor anymore. It was being tested on live patrols, often led by officers willing to gamble their lives on a machinist's intuition. And soon, one of those officers and one of those mechanics would find themselves on a collision course with a Tokyo Express run that would either validate the idea or end with the boat drifting in flames across Iron Bottom Sound. Every PT boat had a heartbeat, and it lived in the engine room. Down there, beneath the deck plates, men like our mechanics spent more time with the Packard engines than they spent with daylight. They worked elbow to elbow in a space barely larger than a small kitchen, surrounded by roaring cylinders, rattling shafts, and the constant vibration that shook bolts loose with every patrol. The metal floor was always warm. The air always tasted faintly of fuel and salt. Machinists' mates were a strange breed in the Navy. They held no officer rank, commanded no guns, and rarely saw the horizon on patrol. But they carried life-or-death responsibility. A single misfire, a clogged fuel line, an overheated piston. Any of these could doom a boat. They were expected not just to maintain engines, but to feel them. Hear when the timing drifted, sense when a manifold was laboring, recognize when exhaust pressure spiked. Our mechanic was one of these men. His name doesn't appear in big histories, but his type appears everywhere in PT squadron diaries. The enlisted innovators who solved problems officers didn't even know existed. He learned early that PT combat wasn't about technical manuals. It was about survival, and survival required creativity. He noticed something no one else paid enough attention to: the difference between engines running with exhaust above the waterline and those venting underwater. Above the water, the Packards roared, a tearing, muscular bellow that echoed like distant thunder. Underwater, they didn't simply get quieter. They changed character entirely. The sea absorbed the bass thrum, muffled the higher notes, and left behind a low, barely perceptible hum. He began timing how long engines could run in underwater mode before heat climbed too high. He listened to vibrations at different throttle settings. He experimented with idle RPM thresholds that let the boat move while staying nearly inaudible. Night after night, this enlisted man saw something that doctrine had overlooked. In the Solomon Islands, silence was a weapon. PT muffler systems were designed with choice in mind: raw power or stealth. But in practice, PT doctrine almost never used the stealth mode because officers were trained to treat these boats as fast attackers. The mufflers had 3 flaps per engine, small mechanical gates that let exhaust exit either into the air or through submerged ports below the waterline. When the flaps were closed, the engine vented into the sea, dramatically cutting noise. However, at anything above low RPM, underwater exhaust became dangerous. Back pressure increased rapidly. Heat climbed. Fuel mix ratios fluctuated. Engines could stall or, worse, seize completely. That's why manuals warned against running submerged exhaust at speed. But the mechanic realized the manuals were written for generic conditions, not for the unique realities of the Solomons. Narrow waterways, flat night seas, overcast skies, and a need for stealth more than power. He charted a delicate balance, running a single Packard at an idle that pushed the boat forward at only a few knots. At this speed, the exhaust dispersed quietly beneath the water. The wake flattened. The boat barely disturbed the surface. On moonless nights, a PT operating like this didn't just become hard to detect. It became nearly invisible. The Japanese hydrophones, tuned for submarine props and high-speed cavitation, struggled to pick up the faint vibrations of a slow-moving wooden hull. The destroyer's optical detection, their greatest strength, was nullified because the PT created no phosphorescent wake. Even radar, primitive on both sides at this stage of the Pacific War, was notoriously unreliable against such a tiny target. By re-engineering the way the PT breathed, the mechanic had transformed it. It was no longer a loud knife slashing through black water. It had become a drifting shadow. As word spread through the squadron, some skippers began integrating the mechanic's idea into night operations. The tactic was simple in theory, but terrifying in execution. Instead of charging toward the Tokyo Express at high speed, PT boats would sit motionless near choke points of the slot, engines off, listening. Then, when destroyer screws began to thrum across the water, the PT would start a single muffled engine at its lowest safe idle. The boat would ease forward, barely moving, leaving no white wake, no engine roar, and no phosphorescent trail. The crew had to whisper. Even dropping a wrench could give them away. They approached from angles with minimal moon reflection, using islands as shadow masks. Some boats drifted with the current, steering only occasionally. Torpedoes were prepped in silence. Gun crews covered the brass catches with cloth to prevent metallic clinks. This wasn't the PT Navy described in stateside newsreels. The daring, fast-swerving boats charging into glory. This was patient, predatory work. And it required trust in an engine room sailor who said, "If we do this right, they won't hear us. They won't see us, and they won't fire until our torpedoes are already in the water." It was radical, it was dangerous, and it was about to be put to the ultimate test. The stage was set for a night when the Tokyo Express thundered down the slot once again, and a single PT boat, guided by silent engines and one mechanic's nerve, waited in the dark. To understand why the silent run worked, you have to understand what the Japanese destroyers expected to hear, and what they were blind to. Japanese night fighting. Doctrine was unmatched in 1942. Their destroyers trained rigorously to detect movement by eye, to coordinate torpedo spreads without radar, and to react instantly to muzzle flashes or phosphorescent wakes. But their hydrophones, rudimentary listening devices intended mainly to detect submerged submarines, had a critical weakness. They were designed for large metal hulls or high-speed cavitation. A PT boat drifting at 3 or 4 knots simply didn't fit the pattern. Hydrophones struggled to detect slow, muffled propeller signatures from wooden craft. The water around Iron Bottom Sound, warm and layered by currents, scattered sound unpredictably, and destroyer bows sliced the water loudly enough that their own hydrodynamic noise often masked faint signals. On deck, Japanese lookouts, some of the finest in the world, relied on the bright, glowing wakes of fast-moving targets. A boat running at 30 knots lit up the surface behind it with a luminous white tail. Even in complete darkness, those wakes were obvious. But a PT on a silent run produced none of it. Its single engine produced almost no phosphorescence. The water behind the stern barely rippled. Instead of a glowing arrow streaking through the black, the boat left a shadow, an absence of disturbance. This mismatch between expectation and reality was the PT's hidden advantage. Japanese destroyer commanders scanning the water from his bridge expected PTs to behave like they always had. Reckless charges at high speed. When that predictable behavior vanished, so did their preparation. They aimed searchlights where wakes should have been. They trained guns where engines should have roared. But the PT boats weren't there anymore. They were stalking from the side. They were drifting silently ahead of the formation. They were waiting in the black water, hidden in the destroyer's blind spot. Not through superior technology, but through deliberate, engineered stillness. The Tokyo Express thundered through the slot each night, confident in its routine. But routine is exactly what innovation destroys. The environmental angle, how Iron Bottom Sound, helped the silent plan nature conspired with the mechanic in ways no stateside designer could have predicted. Iron Bottom Sound was unlike most naval battlegrounds. The night sky over the Solomons was often so dark that even nearby islands became smudges of deeper blackness. Humidity and sea haze absorbed starlight. Rain squalls rolled across the channel with no warning, turning black water into a shifting mirror. These conditions weren't just visual obstacles, they were acoustic ones. In warm equatorial seas, sound bends and refracts through different temperature layers. A destroyer's hydrophones might receive a strong signal in one direction and nothing in another. PT engines running at full power cut through those layers. but a lone Packard at idle blended into the ocean's natural hum. It became part of the sea's background noise, water movement, wave slap, and the distant rumble of the destroyers themselves. Then there was the phosphorescence. Bioluminescent microorganisms filled the waters around Guadalcanal. Any fast-moving object disturbed them, creating sparkling, glowing trails. Japanese lookouts relied heavily on this. American crews feared it. But the silent run produced minimal disturbance. Instead of churning the sea into a glowing ribbon, the muffled PT boat simply parted the surface. No light, no streak, no giveaway, and the geography helped. Narrow channels, uneven coastlines, and jagged island silhouettes created endless shadows. PT skippers learned to hide in these pockets, matching their drift to the currents. In many engagements, the Japanese destroyers passed within a few thousand yards, sometimes closer, never spotting the small wooden hunters lying in ambush. Nature had become an ally. The sea had become the PT's camouflage, and the mechanic had simply learned how to merge machine with environment. At first, officers were skeptical. PT boats were designed to be fast, aggressive, and violent. Turning them into slow-moving ambush craft felt backward, almost cowardly. Doctrine said to strike like a lightning bolt. This new tactic said to behave like a mine. But Guadalcanal was a place where doctrine died quickly. Reports came back each week of failed intercepts, of PT boats illuminated and ripped apart, of torpedoes launched too far and too late. Commanders needed results, and more importantly, they needed their men to come back alive. In that crucible, the line between improvised tactic and operational innovation blurred. Squadron leaders began quietly considering the mechanic's proposal. They spoke with engine room crews, examined test runs, and read early patrol assessments showing reduced detection. One commander put it bluntly during a tense evening briefing. "If the men in the engine room say we can run silent, we try it." That simple statement marked a shift in the PT fleet's culture. Officers stopped dismissing enlisted knowledge. They listened more. They understood that in this war, this particular, brutal, shadowed war, the men covered in grease and exhaust soot often saw the battlefield more clearly than anyone on deck. Thus, the silent run tactic was born not from command, but from trust, a trust that flowed downward and upward. From skippers willing to risk their boats on an enlisted man's idea, from engine room crews willing to gamble their engines on delicate settings, from torpedomen willing to hold fire until they could smell diesel fumes from Japanese destroyers. This trust created a new kind of PT doctrine, one shaped by necessity, environment, and frontline innovation. And that doctrine would soon face its ultimate test. A night when the Tokyo Express charged through the slot once more, and a single PT boat waited silently in its path. The night chosen for the test could not have been darker. Clouds smothered the stars. The sea was flat and oily, a black mirror stretching toward the distant thunder of engines. Word had come from coast watchers on New Georgia. A major Tokyo Express run was racing down the slot. Several destroyers, fast, fully loaded, expected to pass near the northern mouth of Iron Bottom Sound just after midnight. For PT Squadron Command, this was an opportunity. For the crew of PT-44, it was a gamble. Before launch, the skipper gathered his men on the dimly lit deck. No lanterns, no cigarettes. Even breathing felt louder than it should. The mechanic stood near the engine room hatch, wiping grease from his hands with a rag he carried everywhere. "Tonight," the skipper whispered, "we try silent run from the start. No noise, no wake. No mistakes," the crew nodded. They trusted him. But tonight, they were also trusting the mechanic. Below deck, the engine room hummed faintly as the mechanic made final adjustments. He tightened clamps on the muffler flaps, checked water flow through the submerged exhaust ports, and verified the idle RPM setting for the single center engine. Sweat ran down his face in the humid darkness. He knew the margins were razor thin. If the back pressure spiked, the engine could seize. If the temperature rose too quickly, they'd have to open exhaust flaps, and the roar might give them away instantly. But if everything held, they would be ghosts. Just before they cast off, the skipper leaned into the engine room. "You sure about this?" The mechanic didn't hesitate. "Sir, you won't hear us unless you're in the boat with us." The skipper stared at him for a moment, then nodded. "Do it." They pushed off from Tulagi, drifting like a leaf on the current. Only one engine ran, barely above idle. The mechanic tuned it constantly, a touch of throttle here, a fraction down there. The PT slid forward at a walking pace, blending into the blackness. Above deck, the crew strained their ears. The familiar roar of 3 Packards was gone, replaced by the sound of water lapping gently against the hull. No wake glowed behind them. No vibration rattled their teeth. They were not driving a boat. They were gliding. As they neared the northern entrance to Iron Bottom Sound, lookouts spotted faint glimmers on the far horizon. The towering silhouettes of destroyers, backlit by the glow of their own exhaust stacks. The Tokyo Express was coming fast. The skipper whispered, "Hold steady. Drift." PT-44 cut her engine completely. The mechanic kept his hand poised on the starter lever, ready to bring the single Packard back to idle the moment they needed movement. But for now, they simply floated, letting the current carry them like debris. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Destroyer screws began to growl through the water. A deep, steady rumble that vibrated in the crew's ribs. These weren't small ships. These were 2,000-ton giants slicing the night, their bows exploding through the sea at high speed. From their drift position, PT-44 waited like a hunter hidden in a thicket. When the first destroyer's silhouette rose large against the blackness, the skipper finally whispered the words, "Start the center engine." Mufflers submerged. The mechanic eased the throttle forward by millimeters. The Packard came alive, not with a roar, but with a low, soft thrum swallowed by the water beneath the stern. The boat began to creep again, almost imperceptibly. The Japanese column thundered past at high speed, their own wake masking any hint of the PT boat's motion. The PT crew could see the destroyer's running lights, the glow of bridge instruments, even the shadowy figures of lookouts, scanning the darkness. But no one aboard those destroyers had any idea a predator was gliding less than 2,000 yards away. The skipper raised his hand to the torpedo officer, who nodded and prepared the launch controls. The destroyers passed. 1, 2, 3, and then came the target. A large destroyer, heavily loaded, running closer to the coast than usual. Later records would identify her as Teruzuki, one of the Tokyo Express escorts. Fast, heavily armed, and lethal. But tonight, she was blind. The skipper whispered, "Bring us to firing angle." The mechanic adjusted throttle again. Just a whisper of movement. The PT swung gently, silently. The torpedo officer lined up his sights. "Steady! Steady!" The destroyer loomed broadside. Fire. 2 torpedoes released with muffled splashes, their wakes invisible in the darkness. They streaked toward the destroyer like sharks running just beneath the surface. PT-44 immediately cut its engine again, drifting back into the black void. No one breathed. No one spoke. They simply listened. A long silence. Then, a thunderous explosion tore across Iron Bottom Sound. The destroyer's stern erupted in a fireball. Secondary blasts followed, ammunition cooking off, fuel lines rupturing. The ship lurched violently, flames licking up her superstructure. Shouts echoed across the water as Japanese crews scrambled in panic. PT-44, drifting silently, was still unseen. The mechanic watched gauges flicker in the red glow of his engine room. The single Packard remained at idle, cool, and quiet. The boat hadn't been detected. The plan had worked. Above deck, the crew exchanged stunned glances. They had just crippled a Japanese destroyer. Without the enemy ever hearing them, the night wasn't over. The Tokyo Express column was already reacting, and PT-44 had a narrow window to escape. But that escape, the chase, the gunfire, the final sprint. The instant the torpedoes detonated, the night transformed. A column of flame rose from Teruzuki's stern, turning the Black Sea around her into a violent, flickering orange. Metal shrieked as plating buckled. A gun mount toppled. The destroyer's aft deck seemed to lift from the water as the shock wave rippled outward. Men on her stern were thrown into the sea like silhouettes flung against fire. And yet, in all this chaos, PT-44 remained unseen. The crew watched the inferno from just over a mile away, still drifting with their engines silent. The Tokyo Express formation erupted in confusion. Searchlights snapped on and stabbed blindly across the channel, tracing panicked arcs across the water. Automatic guns fired bursts into empty darkness. Orders were shouted so loudly they echoed across the sound, but the destroyers didn't know where the attack had come. From PT-44 had already vanished into the night. The destroyer column instinctively executed a violent turn, forming a defensive circle to guard the damaged ship. Their propellers churned the sea, throwing white froth into the air. A flare hissed upward and burst overhead, bathing the water in harsh white light. The skipper whispered, "Everyone stay low. Don't move, don't breathe." The mechanic re-engaged the center engine, just enough throttle to maintain control, and held it steady at the finely tuned idle he'd practiced for weeks. The underwater exhaust absorbed the vibration, sending it deeper into the sea rather than across the surface. And under that flare's harsh glow, PT-44 simply blended into the still water. Too small, too dark, too motionless to catch the eye of a frantic lookout. The Japanese destroyers swept their searchlights across every quadrant except one, the quiet, low-wake patch of darkness, where PT-44 slithered away like a shadow slipping behind a curtain. One destroyer, perhaps misreading the initial blast, began firing to starboard at phantom wakes. Shells thumped into the water, sending tall plumes skyward. Another destroyer loosed star shells, hoping for a brief, accidental glimpse of their attacker. But the silent run tactic had already robbed them of their instincts. They were searching for a fast-moving threat. The threat had come from a slow, drifting ghost. Aboard Teruzuki, chaos reigned. The torpedo hit had punched into her stern, tearing out steering control and severing power conduits. The ship began to lose way, smoke billowing from her aft quarter. Damage control teams rushed to fight the spreading fires, but as they unspooled hoses, secondary explosions roared from ammunition lockers. Her rudder was jammed. Her stern was sagging. She drifted helplessly. Bleeding fire. The captain barked orders to prepare towing lines, but the Japanese formation was too busy trying to locate the attacker. Minutes of indecision passed. Minutes that sealed her fate. The crippled destroyer fell behind the Tokyo Express column, becoming a burning, isolated target rolling in the dark. Her once deadly silhouette was now a beacon on the water. And PT-44 watched from afar as the enemy they once feared became a glowing wreck, crippled by torpedoes launched in absolute silence. The PT skipper finally murmured, "Bring us about, slow and wide." The mechanic nudged the throttle, the engine whispering beneath the surface. PT-44 turned in a slow arc, hugging the shadow of a nearby island. The searchlights swept lazily across the opposite side of the channel, still hunting something that moved fast, but nothing fast had been there tonight. The PT boat used darkness, geography, and silence to vanish entirely. As they slipped behind the jagged outline of Sandfly Island, the crew heard one last distant blast, Teruzuki's magazine igniting. A fireball rose like a sun reborn. Then came the hollow roar of a ship's soul tearing apart as she broke. Hohen Snan rolled and slowly disappeared into Iron Bottom Sound. The mechanic, still in the engine room, allowed himself the first real breath he'd taken in an hour. His hands trembled lightly on the throttle, but the engine remained cool and steady, exactly as he'd predicted it would. Above him, the skipper leaned heavily against the chart table, processing what had just happened. No cheering, no celebration, just stunned, exhausted relief. Because the truth was simple. They had survived a night no PT boat crew should have survived, and struck a blow no one believed a wooden craft drifting on one engine could deliver. Hours later, PT-44 eased into the dim glow of Tulagi's shoreline. Dawn was still an hour away. Their hull was wet with spray, their torpedo racks empty, their nerves stretched thin. Waiting on the dock were officers, mechanics, and fellow crewmen, roused by reports of a massive explosion in the Sound. When PT-44 tied up, men swarmed the pier with questions. The skipper stepped off the boat first. When someone asked what happened, he simply pointed to the mechanic climbing out of the engine hatch. "Ask him," the skipper murmured. It was his idea. Every head turned. The mechanic, still smeared with grease, exhausted, blinking in the lantern glow, looked stunned. But the results were undeniable. A Japanese destroyer crippled and doomed. A PT boat undetected. A tactic proven in the clearest possible way. And from that night forward, silent running was no longer a crazy idea whispered in the engine room. It became doctrine. It became survival. It became legend. Now came the aftermath. The consequences of that night, the Japanese reaction, and how one idea reshaped the PT war in the Solomons. Dawn broke slowly over Iron Bottom Sound, revealing a landscape of smoke, drifting debris, and distant plumes rising where the Tokyo Express had retreated into the open ocean. The glow of Teruzuki's final explosion still hung faintly over the water, a mark on the horizon telling every sailor who saw it that something extraordinary had happened during the night. At Tulagi, word spread through the PT squadrons long before any official report was filed. Men spoke in hushed, incredulous tones about a PT boat that had crept right into the path of a destroyer formation, fired torpedoes, and escaped without taking a single round of return fire. It sounded impossible. PT boats weren't built for stealth. They weren't submarines. They weren't meant to stalk giants, and yet PT-44 had done exactly that. As officers assembled in the hastily built operations shack, walls sweating in the morning, humidity, the skipper of PT-44 delivered his account. The room fell silent as he described the approach. One engine at idle, mufflers submerged. No wake, no phosphorescence, no discovery. He explained how they drifted closer than doctrine allowed, how the destroyers thundered past unaware, and how their torpedoes struck a ship that never even saw them. Some officers stared, disbelief plain on their faces. Others leaned forward, eyebrows furrowed in focused recognition. They understood what this meant. The most stunned reactions came from those who had doubted the mechanic. Now, those same men crowded him after the briefing, firing questions about throttle control, exhaust temperatures, and back pressure limits. The once dismissed mechanic became the center of gravity in a room filled with ranking officers. For PT crews, this wasn't just technical validation. It was emotional vindication. They had lost friends to the Tokyo Express. They had endured nights of humiliation, charging in boldly, only to be illuminated, bracketed, and shredded by destroyer fire. They had watched wooden hulls burn on black water, while destroyers escaped untouched. Now, for the first time, they had struck the Tokyo Express on equal footing and gotten away with it. The sinking of Teruzuki was more than a tactical victory. It was symbolic. She had been one of the more aggressive and capable escorts in the nightly runs. Her loss meant the Japanese had one fewer tool to protect the vital supply route that fed their starving forces on Guadalcanal. Japanese records later indicated that confusion reigned aboard the destroyers in the moments following the explosion. Lookouts reported no wakes, no silhouettes, no muzzle flashes. Officers suspected mines. Aircraft dropped torpedoes, even friendly torpedoes gone astray. But few considered a drifting PT boat. To them, PT boats were reckless, noisy, obvious, and usually driven off quickly. The idea that one could glide in silently simply didn't match their understanding of American tactics. This confusion had real consequences. With no clear idea where the attack came from, the Japanese escort formation spent precious minutes firing at nothing and circling in disarray. Meanwhile, the crew of Teruzuki fought desperately to save their ship. But without steering control and with flames spreading rapidly, they were doomed. Her final explosion, likely her magazines igniting, was heard on islands miles away. The sea claimed her shortly afterward, adding her to the growing graveyard that gave Iron Bottom Sound its name. When the official report reached higher command, the language was restrained, as was typical of wartime documentation. But between the lines, something new pulsed with life. Phrases like reduced, detection likely due to limited engine output, and recommend further evaluation of muffled single-engine approaches. These were understated acknowledgments of a revelation. Squadron. Commanders began quietly issuing instructions for selective silent running trials on future patrols. Not all boats, not all nights, conditions had to be right. But from this point forward, PT doctrine was no longer a single path. It had forked. Speed remained a weapon. But now so was silence. PT-44's crew knew what this meant. They had felt something shift in the dark waters of Iron Bottom Sound, something that would change every patrol that followed. Now came the broader consequences across the Solomons, how this one success triggered changes in tactics, morale, and enemy behavior. In the weeks following the Silent Run attack, the landscape of the night war in the Solomons began to shift. The change wasn't dramatic at first. No sudden sweeping victories, no collapse of the Tokyo Express, but among the PT crews, something deeper had taken root. Confidence. They had proven that their tiny wooden boats, fragile and loud by design, could become predators in the very environment that once swallowed them whole. Soon, PT squadrons stationed on Tulagi, Banika, and other islands began experimenting with their own variations of silent run procedures. Skippers compared notes. Mechanics exchanged diagrams and hand-drawn charts of optimum RPM levels. Torpedomen practiced prepping tubes without letting the metal clink. Even lookouts retrained their eyes for slower movement patterns instead of the old high-speed intercepts. The doctrine was no longer theoretical. It was now a working method. Boats began launching with mixed settings. One engine idling in underwater exhaust mode. One engine warmed but offline for silent approach. One engine held in reserve for escape. On certain patrols, entire sections of PT boats coordinated silent drifts, using island silhouettes to mask their positions before approaching converging Japanese columns. Reports began to appear in patrol logs describing undetected contact, successful shadowing, or torpedoes fired without enemy illumination. To the men who had survived months of being chased, spotted and shelled. These words carried immense power. For the Imperial Navy, the loss of Teruzuki was a troubling sign. Night operations had long been their domain of superiority. Their destroyer crews were elite, wolves of the night, as some Allied sailors called them. They prided themselves on seeing targets before being seen, on striking first, and striking hard. But Teruzuki's destruction created an unsettling question within their command. How had an American torpedo attack come from the dark without warning? Some Japanese officers initially suspected drift mines laid by aircraft. Others believed submarines had snuck into the channel. A few blamed faulty lookout performance, but no explanation fully satisfied them. The American PT boats, in their view, behaved rashly and noisily. They were pests, not ghosts. Now, however, the destroyer captains became more cautious. Escort formations began adjusting their speeds. Lookouts stared into blackness longer and with more anxiety. Hydrophone operators, once confident they could hear PT boats miles away, now argued over faint noises, unsure which sounds were real threats and which were the sea's natural hum. And most importantly, the Japanese destroyers began firing more often at shadows. Every splash of water, every flicker in the dark, every hint of movement drew automatic gunfire. The Tokyo Express lost some of its cool discipline. Ammunition expenditure rose. Coordination suffered. The certainty that had once dominated their night runs now wavered. Fear had entered the equation. Not overwhelming fear, but the kind that makes skilled sailors hesitate. And hesitation is deadly at sea. For the American PT sailors, the change was transformative. They were still underdogs, still vulnerable to shells and searchlights, but for the first time, they felt that innovation, their innovation, could tilt the scale. Crews customized their boats with small modifications, extra insulation around engine mounts to dampen vibrations, cloth-wrapped metal parts to reduce incidental noise, improved water jacket checks to prevent overheating in muffled mode, even small wooden wedges to secure loose gear that could rattle under movement. What once felt like desperation had become craftsmanship. The mechanic from PT-44 suddenly found himself an informal instructor, teaching others how to maintain stable back pressure, how to read exhaust flow by touch, and how to throttle down until the boat felt more like a drifting log than a powered craft. He never claimed credit. He never sought recognition. But the crews knew, and the officers knew. And in war, knowledge is the purest currency of respect. Silencing the PT boats didn't win Guadalcanal by itself. Many battles still raged. Aircraft, infantry, and major fleet units continued to shape the campaign. But silent running contributed to a crucial psychological and tactical shift. The Japanese no longer commanded the night with absolute certainty. The Tokyo Express continued its desperate missions, but every run now carried a shadow of doubt. The sense that something, somewhere out there in the black water, might be watching, and American commanders recognized the significance. Silent running drills became regular parts of PT training across the Solomons. Reports of undetected approaches increased. Torpedo effectiveness improved. The PT fleet, once considered a minor nuisance, became a persistent thorn in the Japanese supply chain. Most importantly, every success traced its lineage back to that one night, that one PT boat, and that one mechanic whose improbable idea reshaped the tactics of the smallest combatants in one of the largest oceans ever fought over. That impact leads naturally into the final thoughts, the reflection on what this moment meant for the war and the people who fought it. In the stillness of Iron Bottom Sound today, the water gives nothing away. It hides its dead well. Beneath its calm surface lie cruisers, transports, destroyers, Japanese and American, each resting silently in the dark silt. Their stories are scattered across the seabed, like pages torn from a book no one will ever completely read. But among those stories is one night that changed the way small boats fought large enemies. The silent run tactic didn't come from admirals or laboratories or the polished halls of naval command. It came from a mechanic working in heat, darkness, and noise, a sailor whose world was measured not in maps or strategy, but in the pulse of an engine and the feel of vibration through a steel plate. He wasn't searching for glory. He was searching for survival. And in doing so, he discovered a way to make his fragile wooden craft disappear in a war built on fire and noise. That is the quiet truth of innovation in wartime. Sometimes the greatest shifts happen not through sweeping plans or grand maneuvers, but through the courage of someone who sees the world differently. Someone who dares to ask, what if we try it another way? The silent-running PT boats didn't decide the Pacific War, but they changed the rhythm of the night battles in the Solomons. They forced the Tokyo Express to slow, to doubt, to fear. They protected American Marines fighting for their foothold on Guadalcanal. They showed that creativity could be as lethal as firepower, and they proved that warfare is not only shaped by admirals and captains, but by the hands of the men who maintain the engines, load the torpedoes, and steer the craft through black water with their hearts pounding in their throats. If you stand on the shores of Iron Bottom Sound at night, you can almost imagine it. The faintest hum of a muffled engine, the whisper of a wooden hull gliding across still water, the idea that silence, wielded by a single mechanic, once turned a tiny boat into a weapon feared by destroyers. History remembers the loud moments, but sometimes the most important victories begin in silence.